Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Hello, my lovely friend. Welcome to Delingpole, the show featuring me, James Delingpole, brought to you by Breitbart and Podcast One. Did you like the hello, lovely friend touch? Does it make you feel more loved and wanted, like you've got a more intimate thing going on? Well, you've got loyal and cherished listener Brian Robinson for that. Brian points out that when you listen to a podcast, you're on your own, not with a bunch of other people, so you don't want to be called lovely listeners. You're just you, the listener. You and me, all alone. What fun we're going to have. And we bloody are too. This week's podcast, in all modesty, is totally brilliant. It's with a chap called Tony Heller, whose name you may not know, but if you're a climate skeptic, it's possible you'll recognise him by his Twitter handle, Stephen Goddard. Stephen, or Tony rather, runs a skeptical website called realclimatescience.com. I often go there to nick my climate stories, for Tony has at least two qualities I greatly admire. One, he loathes greenies at least as much as I do and doesn't pull his punches. Two, he really knows his stuff. Tony's background is geology and electrical engineering. What this means is that he has the skill set to analyse data. He's comfortable with graphs and charts and reams of figures, and for the last 10 years he has been using this knowledge ruthlessly to take apart one of the main pillars of climate alarmism. I'm talking about the temperature data sets maintained by two US government institutions, the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA for short. This is a really big and important story. My friend Christopher Booker thinks it's probably the biggest scandal in scientific history. If what Tony Heller is saying is right, then NOAA and NASA, those two lavishly funded US government institutions, are guilty of fraud. Essentially, they've been cooking the books, tampering with the data, adjusting the evidence in order to make global warming look more scary and dramatic. Everyone, climate skeptics and alarmists alike, is in rough agreement that the world has warmed by just under 1 degree centigrade in the last 150 years or so since we started coming out of what's known as the Little Ice Age. But what the guys in charge of the records at NASA and NOAA have been doing, allegedly, he said, is fiddling with the raw data, not for scientific ends, but rather in pursuit of a political agenda. I'll leave it to Tony Heller to explain the hows and whys of this. If he's right, then all that dramatic, unprecedented, scary global warming we've been told about for the last few decades is in fact a load of rubbish. You're listening to Delingpole, brought to you by Breitbart and Podcast One, and you are so going to want to give this show a 5-star review on iTunes when you've heard it. Welcome my special guest, Tony Heller. And Tony, I would say, is, like me, at the more extreme end of climate change skepticism, which is to say that we don't just dispute the science, we also dispute the integrity of the temperature records, that we think that fraud is going on. Now, Tony, tell me about this. When did you first get into the idea that institutions like NOAA and NASA were rigging the temperature data sets?
Right. Well, I was, it's great to be here, James. Thank you.
Hey, thanks.
I was a global warming true believer.
Oh, you were?
Oh, yeah, for decades. I was working as a researcher at Los Alamos Labs in the late 70s and early 80s, and my boss introduced me to the concept, and it seemed to make sense. There was a lot of things going on. That was a period of warming, and I was working in the UK quite a bit in the 90s. And I could see that things were warming up here. It wasn't snowing as much. I went to high school near Oxford in the 60s and 70s, and I could see the big difference by the mid-90s. There wasn't snowing anymore. I would fly into Heathrow, and I would see people water skiing in February. And
Really?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, around 98, 99. And so it all seemed to make sense. And but things started changing around 2003. I was actually in Cambridge on Robbie Burns night in 2003, and a big snowstorm came in. It was the first big snow they'd had in years. And I started wondering, well, if this is sort of a linear carbon dioxide thing, this really shouldn't be happening. It should just keep getting warmer. So I started questioning it and just got interested and started looking at data sets. And I started noticing something very strange around about 2007, 2008, that the data kept changing. And so you would see a graph from NASA one year and it would look very different from a graph they had made several years earlier. And I was particularly interested because went to high school and college during the global cooling scare in the 1970s, and I remembered that very clearly. So I started digging up from the internet like old temperature graphs, like one in particular from 1974 from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and another one from 1975 from the National Academy of Sciences, which both showed that there was a lot of warming prior to 1940, and then after World War II, temperatures cooled dramatically. And actually, there really wasn't any net warming from about 1870 to 1970 in those versions of the graph.
Where was this data? Where did you find it all?
Oh, just from old newspaper archives.
Right. So you really had got the bit between your teeth, but because I mean this is quite obsessive, one might say.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, I'm a history buff anyway. I've always enjoyed history, and this just became a very interesting topic for me.
So it was a hobby?
Yeah, it was just a hobby, right? And it still is. I don't get any funding for doing this. It's just become something where the more I got into it, it was like I was doing detective work. I was doing forensics, it was like I had discovered a crime scene, and I wanted to understand who was behind it.
I've noticed this a lot, actually, being on the skeptical side of the argument, that there seem to have been a few lone obsessive heroes. You think of Steve McIntyre,
right,
for example, and everyone's doing it pro bono. It's not like
right.
You've got on the one hand this vast edifice, this huge establishment, the alarmist establishment, which is propping up this theory with lots and trillions of dollars of money, probably. And on the other side, you've got people like you.
Right. Well, they say if you see something, say something. I saw something, and I saw something big, and I realized something was very wrong.
People would probably be wondering, but people who weren't sure which side of the argument to come down on, they say, well, who is this guy, Tony Heller, anyway? How do you have the expertise to analyse this stuff? So what's your answer to that?
Well, I have an undergraduate degree in geology, so I've always had a lot of interest in Earth-related processes. And I have a master's degree in electrical engineering. And a big part of my I've done quite a few different things as an electrical engineer, but one of them was a verification of microprocessor designs, which are huge designs, billions of transistors, some of the designs I've worked on. And my job was to make sure that every single transistor, everything in there was perfect before it went off to the fab, because it's extremely expensive for companies like Intel to send a defective part to the fab. It costs them months of time and potentially billions of dollars in loss. So they put a lot of effort into making sure that their designs are perfect, these very large designs. And my job was to assume that everybody who had worked on it was wrong and go in and analyze it, use as many different techniques as I could to analyze their database and find everything that was wrong with it. And I was extremely successful at this. So I took the same sort of approach, this engineering approach of assuming that everything I was looking at was wrong, and analyzing from that point and just doing very detailed data analysis using a lot of different techniques. And every time I did, I came to the conclusion that what these people at NASA and NOAA were doing with the temperature data was just wrong.
We'll come on to your theories as to why this might be in a moment. But first of all, how did you bring this information to public awareness?
I first started just doing comments on articles that other people were writing, and I wrote an article, a comments on an article I think that Andrew Orlowski wrote in the Register about 10 years ago, and he liked my comment. He asked me to write a article myself in the Register. I was working for a very green company at the time who wouldn't have appreciated going under my name, so Andrew agreed to let me write it under a pen name. So I went on an internet.
You became Stephen Goddard.
Right.
Yeah. Because I mean, Tony Heller is still a fairly unknown figure, but Stephen Goddard is. I like his attack. He's quite uncompromising on Twitter, certainly, and in his columns, I notice.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's, I've worked on many very mission critical engineering projects. I've done visualization systems for Defense Department drones. I've worked on the safety analysis report for Department of Energy's nuclear waste disposal project. And pretty much everything I do in engineering, everything has to be perfect. So that I just took the same approach that everything has to be right or I'm not happy.
I've heard this said a lot of engineers, that of all the scientific disciplines, engineers tend to be the ones most skeptical about the climate change thing, because obviously if you're building a bridge, you can't afford for that bridge to fall down. Real lives are at stake. So it's not a kind of abstract science, it's very practical.
Right. And a good example of that was recently BBC presenter Brian Cox went down to Australia and did a Q&A show with Senator Malcolm Roberts. And he held up this graph, this NASA temperature graph, and said, "I've got the graph." And then he implied that anybody who disputed NASA also probably didn't believe we went to the moon.
Yes.
And
that's right.
Right, and so I went down to Australia recently and worked with Senator Roberts, and we did some presentations in Parliament. And my point was, I went through in very detail about why everything Brian Cox said was absolutely 100% wrong. He had everything backwards. And I think my closing comment was, in the press conference, was, had the people at NASA doing the temperature records been working on the space program, that rocket never would have gotten off the ground, much less gotten to the moon.
It is extraordinary, isn't it, how the institution that put a man on the moon has, certainly under President Obama and perhaps before, become an institution for, A, Muslim outreach, right. Apparently, according to a speech given by the head of NASA in 2010, and also it has become a promulgator of, under its department, GIS, Goddard Institute for Space Studies, it's become a promulgator of false data.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They show this, very strong warming trend over the last 120 years, which basically forms the blade of the hockey stick. But when you go in and look at the data much more closely, you realize that it's probably wrong. And particularly over the last 15 or 16 years, if you look at the NASA temperature graphs, they show that the global temperatures have risen fairly dramatically over the last 15 years. But nobody else believes this. Like satellite data, there's two sets of satellite data measuring temperatures in the troposphere. Neither of them show this warming at all. And even Michael Mann has published papers talking about this pause, this hiatus, over the last 15 years, which the NASA graphs don't show anymore. And they used to. They used to show it, but they keep changing the data.
When did it start? This
right, and that's a very good question. It started. The really big changes started right around the time when Michael Mann was making the hockey stick. Interestingly enough, prior to that, James Hansen, the guy who's sort of the godfather of global warming data tampering.
Yes.
He wrote a paper in 1999 where he was very troubled by the fact that the U.S. temperature record was not warming. In fact, had been cooling, showed cooling. And he specifically said, why are U.S. temperatures going down during a time when greenhouse gases are rapidly rising?
Was this included in the ClimateGate emails? I've forgotten. Was that?
No. This was it's still on the NASA website. Right. This page, but then magically, right after this was in 1999, and then the hockey stick came out right around that time, and all of a sudden the temperature data started changing that, and suddenly the U.S. went from the NASA graphs went from showing U.S. cooling to showing U.S. warming, and it wasn't because of a change in the temperature. There was a big warming spike in 1998. It was because they had altered the data. They started doing this major alterations to the data set.
So, is your suggestion that fellow travellers in NASA read Michael Mann's papers and thought, we can help him out here?
I don't have any specific evidence, but I would guess it was much more than that. I believe there was probably collusion. And some of the ClimateGate emails show this. There was an email from Tom Wigley to Phil Jones where they were discussing they wanted to get rid of the 1940s blip in temperature.
So if you're right, and I think, talking to Christopher Booker, I think he would share this view, that this must count among the biggest scientific frauds in history.
I post that frequently and tweet that concept constantly.
Actually, bigger than ClimateGate. I mean, ClimateGate was exciting, but if we can genuinely demonstrate that, I mean, I don't know how much funding NASA gets and how much NOAA gets, but these two massive American scientific institutions, if they have been fiddling with the evidence to demonstrate something which isn't true, then that's a scandal of epic proportions.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the message has been heard in the Trump administration, and there's been lots of news reports the last week, I don't know how accurate they are, that they're going to take NASA out of the climate business and move it into other agencies.
You see, I'm wondering, actually, we in Britain, as you're probably aware, I'd say probably about 95% of people, because they get their information from the BBC, think that the election of Trump is pretty much like putting the bastard love child of Satan and Ronald McDonald in the White House. And I'm one of Trump's few defenders, and certainly on the climate change front, I wonder whether any other Republican candidate would have been quite so uncompromising as Trump is going to be. They'd have all been squishes to some degree.
Right.
They'd have felt a need to compromise with NASA and NOAA. They wouldn't want to rock the boat. But Trump is untainted by that. He is a true disbeliever, you might say.
Oh, yeah, he's been tweeting for years that the whole thing's a scam. And what's interesting was he made a tweet in 2012 where he said it was a scam designed for and by the Chinese. Yeah. And I don't know if I believe that it was designed by the Chinese, but there's a lot of evidence that he's correct about it being for the Chinese. And if you look at the Paris Treaty, it doesn't actually do anything to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. What it does is it just shifts it from Western countries to China, because the agreement that Obama made with China allows them to continue increasing their CO2 emissions, and they're bringing a new coal-fired power plant on every 10 days or so.
Well, there are at least two reasons why the COP21 agreement in Paris is toothless and meaningless. One is, as you rightly say, because the Chinese and the Indian delegations made damn sure that any agreement made wouldn't affect their economic growth. Right. And I think they had a clause saying, if these carbon emissions reductions conflict with our need for economic growth, then economic growth comes first. That was the first thing. But the second thing was weirder, I thought, and rather funny, that the delegation from the US, the Obama administration, changed the word shall to should.
Right.
Which means that suddenly it just became an aspiration rather than a binding agreement which would have to be passed by Congress, which probably it was never going to be anyway. So all this fuss about Trump is going to scrap the Paris Agreement, I mean, whether he does or it doesn't isn't going to make a blind bit of difference to the global carbon dioxide output. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And if it actually was implemented, which, like you said, it won't be, it would clearly be, the intent was to hurt the United States and Europe, and to give countries like China and India whatever they wanted, and provide, I guess, sort of guilt money to a lot of third world countries who signed on happily to receive this money.
I sometimes feel that where climate change is concerned, the lunatics were allowed to take over the asylum for 4 decades.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, when was the key moment where it all started going wrong? Was it the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, or was it earlier than that?
Oh, I think it was really 1988 when James Hansen testified in Congress.
That famous scene where he rigged it so that he fiddled with the air conditioning,
Right.
so that there was sweat pouring down his face as
Right. And the interesting thing about that too is that 1988 was, in some sense, the hottest summer in Washington, D.C. history in terms of numbers of very hot days. And since then, they haven't had a hot summer like that. So they had a combination of very hot summer. They scheduled the hearing for what they found out was historically the hottest day of the summer in D.C. They opened the window, sabotaged the air conditioner, then they got him up there sweating and made it look horrible. But they've never had a summer like that again.
And this was done with the collusion of a senator, wasn't it? Tim Worth.
Right.
From Colorado.
Right.
From your state.
Yes.
So one of your people was responsible for this.
We have a lot of nutters in Colorado. Yeah.
But why is Tim Worth still a thing?
Don't know.
No.
I think he's still around.
But there are some influential senators, aren't there, who are and congressmen who are promoting this particular line still.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The guy from Rhode Island, he's a complete nutcase.
Oh right, yeah, White House. Yeah.
Whose wife is heavily involved in the green industry. I mean,
Right.
follow the money.
Right.
These guys are crooks.
Oh yeah. You know, it's interesting if you go to a Senate hearing on climate, the Democrats are extremely organized. They have a script which they all read from. They all say the same things, and as opposed to the Republicans who are always just very chaotic and they don't really have a plan. But the Democrats have the same line. They say the same things. You know exactly what they're going to say, and they have an effective sort of propaganda technique which they've perfected, and they do it over and over again.
And yet, people like you and me have for years been dismissed as cranks. I mean, even our own side has felt slightly uncomfortable, I think, about having us on the team. I remember going to. I'm very fond of going to those climate summits organised by Heartland, and I've got lots of friends at places like What's Up With That. But I get this sense that people who are scientists want it to be a scientific argument rather than an argument about fraud. They feel uncomfortable. They feel like it's too much of a wacko conspiracy theory, and so they've balked at saying it too often.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And I have a pretty funny story about that. In 2011, I was invited to an EU event in Lisbon, and the idea was they wanted to sort of make some of the more badly behaved skeptics behave better.
Oh yes,
and so they brought together a bunch of people from both sides, climate scientists and skeptics, and one of the guys was Steve McIntyre there. And as soon as I started talking, Steve interrupted me and basically told me to shut up because the people into this, the scientific, very deep, you want to stick with the science side, don't like my approach.
No.
Right.
I think we should talk about more in the next section. This is really interesting. I'm talking to Tony Heller, who's one of the world's, I think, most hardcore climate skeptics, and I think about to be vindicated by history.
Clark Howard here. I have a lot of empowerment for you and your wallet available on my podcast that's available at Podcast One, iTunes, or at Clark.com. I want you to save money big time. That's my job. That's my promise.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
So here I am, James Delingpole, back with my special guest, climate skeptic, climate hero, I would say, Tony Heller. Now, Tony, I want to luxuriate a bit longer about our wonderfulness, our courage, and our rightness, because I know that a lot of people, even on our side of the argument, say, I wish that James Delingpole was a bit less aggressive. I wished Tony Heller, with his crazy conspiracy theories, he's a bit damned embarrassing, because what he's doing is he's alienating the people in the middle ground. And I think we should reach out more to people on the alarmist or the warmist side of the argument, whatever. What do you say to those people who think that we should be more emollient?
Well, I hear that, people calling me a conspiracy theorist, and I always ask them, I say, well, what is it you think I'm doing? All I'm doing is just looking at data. And it's not like, they say there's 20, 30,000. Why do you disagree with 20 or 30,000 scientists? And I say, well, I'm not. I'm just basically looking at work that's being done by a very small handful of people at a couple of institutions for the most part. And yes, there's maybe lots of scientists whose work depends on the accuracy of that small group of people. And so it's very important, I think, that everyone should be listening to me and these people and saying, is the data which they're getting from these people at NASA and NOAA, is it accurate? Because it affects their work.
Yes. I also think that what people want, or rather, let's put it another way, what the alarmist camp wants to impose on us is the idea that we should have a consistent argument. In other words, make up your minds, guys. Are you saying that CO2 makes no difference to climate, or are you saying that it's outright fraud? You can't argue both things. Well, of course you can argue both things, because they are facets of the same argument. Can you just explain what it exactly is that you found NASA and NOAA doing to the temperature data sets?
Right. Okay. So with the U.S. temperature data, it's very clear what they're doing. The U.S. has the best temperature record in the world, the most complete, thorough, long-range.
Going back to when?
To around 1895. But there's some places that go, considerably further than that. But for the country as a whole, it starts looking coherent around 1895. Which is the traditional date. And if you look through their data, it's all out there. They show it. They provide a data set which is the raw temperature data, which is sort of transcribed temperatures from daily temperatures from thermometers for all the different stations with a fair amount of detail. And then they have another data set which is called the final data set, which is after all their adjustments. So being a computer guy, I'm a programmer, and so I wrote some pretty extensive software for analyzing these different data sets. So it's very easy to make a graph of what is the average temperature per year of the raw and final temperature data. And what you see is, excuse me, you see is that in the raw temperature data that the U.S. has been cooling since the 1920s. Basically went through very strong cooling period till about 1970, and there was some warming until about 1998, and then it's been cooling again since then.
So let me just get you to say that again.
Yeah.
You are saying that America has been cooling since the 20s?
Yeah, it's the trend since the 1920s is down if you look at the actual thermometer data.
I thought the 1930s was the hottest period in America.
Well, the 30s was the hottest, but there was a lot of warmth in the 20s. But if you start a trend line in the 1920s to the present, you see it's cooled slightly.
Right.
Yeah.
What about the rest of the world?
The rest of the world. Okay, so there's this concept has been widely promulgated that there's such a thing as a global temperature record. But if you look at the actual data, which I've done in some detail, I realize it's a farce. There's very poor coverage of most of the world. They have almost no temperature data from Africa, very little from South America, almost none from Antarctica, little from a lot of Greenland and Russia and parts of Asia.
Because these places are either too remote or their political basket cases are incapable of.
Yeah, right. And and there were ClimateGate emails. Like there was one famous one from Phil Jones for the ocean data.
Phil Jones from the University of East Anglia Climatic Research Unit, yeah.
Right. And he said that most of the ocean normals in a lot of the southern hemisphere were mostly made up because they didn't have any temperature data. And I found articles about land data from the 1970s in the New York Times saying we don't have enough temperature data from the southern hemisphere to make a coherent temperature record.
So how do they make up this stuff? What criteria?
They have models. They use models to create fake data from places that don't exist, and it's even gotten into the United States now. In each month now in the U.S. temperature record, about almost 45% of the temperature data is fabricated. They don't have any thermometer reading for a site, so they use a computer model to generate what they think the temperature data was. And actually, all of the warming that they show, in recent warming they show in the U.S. temperature record, is due to fabricated data. I've plotted the actual measured, adjusted data versus the fabricated data. There's no, even in their adjusted, measured data, do they show no warming since 1990. But in the fabricated data, they show a very strong warming trend. So all of the warming, recent warming in the U.S. that they show is due to data that they just made up. They don't actually have any temperature readings.
Okay, so if we accept for a moment that you're right, and that what we have on our hands is the greatest scientific scandal probably in history, or one of them, along with Lysenkoism, except Lysenkoism was the Soviet Union, whereas this is global. And you've been writing about this stuff for 10 years.
Yeah.
Why is it still so relatively little known?
Well, this is a religion, right? These people talk about, they're saving the planet, they're saving Mother Earth, that this is all goodness. Anybody who questions it is evil. And very few people have the strength to stand up to that, right? I mean, it's like the emperor, it's sort of an emperor's new clothes story. We have this official line that this is going on, and very few people feel that they have the qualifications to stand up and say that what you're hearing from these experts is not true. And even if they see it, like with the emperor's new clothes, there are lots of people out there who saw that the emperor wasn't wearing any clothes, but it took a small child to just state the obvious and get the point across.
People don't want to be ridiculed or worse, because there's a lot of evidence that people on our side of the argument have their careers destroyed, get denied tenure, get their papers not published.
Yeah, I was very good friends with Dr. Bill Gray, who was the guy who invented hurricane forecasting. He was considered the top tropical meteorologist in the world. He passed away, unfortunately.
I knew Bill. Yeah. He was a lovely guy. And isn't it interesting? You can tell me more about what happened to him in a moment. But a lot of the guys you see at these skeptical conferences are old guys, often retired guys, because they no longer need to fight for the crumbs of...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Bill, Bill and I were very good friends, and one of my favorite stories of his was how he got money from NOAA for his hurricane research every year from the 60s until 1993, which not coincidentally was the year that Al Gore took office as vice president, and so Al Gore sent him an invitation to come attend some global warming event that he was having, and Bill said, I'd be happy to come to this, but you need to know that I'm not a big fan of this global warming theory. And so he never heard back, and his funding got cut off. He never got another penny out of the government after he said this. And we're talking, the top hurricane forecaster in the world, the most respected hurricane forecaster in the world, couldn't get any money out of NOAA because he went up against he was a heretic. He went up against what the authorities were trying to do. And I think everybody in climate science understands this. And Judith Curry's talked about this a lot. If you go along with it, if you toe the line, play their game, you get very huge amounts of funding. There's billions of dollars in funding available. You don't do it, you get cut off, you get ostracized. I would walk down the hallways at the Colorado State University Atmospheric Sciences Department with Bill Gray. People wouldn't talk to him. They wouldn't look at him because he was a heretic who was hurting their funding.
Yeah, but people I think a lot of people would say the reason people didn't talk to Bill Gray is because obviously he's a crank, because he's outside mainstream science, and they'd say that this guy Tony Heller, who we haven't heard of, he can't be an expert because he hasn't got a job at an institution, and they're going to say, look, this is a massive conspiracy theory. It's got to be, because no way would the entire scientific establishment in the US say something that wasn't true. Scientists don't do that. The scientists are seekers after truth. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, like I said before, there's very few people involved in generating these temperature records. It's not a massive thing. It's maybe half a dozen or a dozen people total involved in this. There are thousands of scientists whose work is derived from their work, and they depend on it being accurate. I mean, if you're doing climate modeling and the past temperature record that you're basing your models on is wrong, then your climate model is getting wrong. Or if you're doing any sort of forecasting, biological forecasting based on these temperature records, and the temperature records are wrong, then your work is meaningless. So if this was an honest, open venture that was going on in climate science, these people would be welcoming these questions. They want to say, "Hey, let's get together and take a hard look at this NASA and NOAA data and find out whether it's legitimate or not. Find out why has the data changed? Why did the 1940 to 1970 global cooling disappear?" But we don't see that. Instead, we see just silence, see censorship. And it's very troubling to me, and I think it's based on this whole thing of people understand, everybody in the community understands that if they go along, they get funding, they get their nice meetings in Cancun and places like that.
They do seem to choose particularly nice locations for their meetings, don't they?
Yeah, they don't.
Paris, Cancun, where else? Durban.
Yeah, lots of
sunny places.
They don't hold them in Siberia, interestingly.
No. Nor in Fernando Po,
right,
or anywhere
right
disagreeable.
Yeah, it was interesting. Recently there's all this talk about this record warmth at the North Pole in recent weeks, and it was record warmth being like -7 or -8 degrees, not actually tropical. But the reason that it was warm there was because the cold air, which normally sits over the North Pole, had gone into Russia, and they were having temperatures in Russia that were 50 degrees below normal.
Right.
So
there isn't this consistent. This is one of the myths, isn't it?
Right.
There was this consistent global temperature.
Oh, right.
Which
yeah,
it's absurd when you think about how big the world is.
Right.
It's going to move around a bit.
Right. And then all this hysteria about the Arctic, right? So if you go back and look at newspaper records and things were written by scientists from the 1940s, Dr. Hans Ullmann, who was sort of was the senior glaciologist of Sweden, had a lot of articles out there about how the glaciers of Greenland and Norway were melting catastrophically, and they were nearing catastrophic collapse. And there had been a huge amount of warming in the Arctic from 1910 to around 1940, and everything was melting down. And there were articles from scientists predicting that all of the glaciers in Glacier National Park in Montana would be gone by 1950. Like 25 years later, we still see those same predictions now that they'll all be gone in 25 years. Like every 25 years, they make that same prediction. So it was, why aren't we looking at these historical records, and why isn't the scientific community examining this fact? That the temperature, a lot of past stuff has been changed. It's been very warm in the past in the Arctic.
Well, we've just discovered Captain Scott's records from the Antarctic, which show that there really has been very little ice lost, contrary to what the experts have been telling us.
Right. But the one place where they have lost a lot of ice in Antarctica is the West Antarctic ice shelf.
Yes.
And that has been going on for hundreds of years. There's lots of documentation that between the time it was first seen, I think by Captain Cook, I believe, in the a long time ago, and by 1930, the Ross Ice Shelf retreated about 30 miles. This was long before global warming was an issue, and There's was the head of the National Science Foundation glaciology program in 1970s. His last name was Cameron. I forgot what it's Richard, I believe. Said in 1976. He said the West Antarctic ice shelf is on its way out. This was during the global cooling scare. He said it has nothing to do with climate. It's just the dynamics of unstable ice. And now you see all these articles from NASA. The West Antarctic ice sheet is going to collapse, and it's your fault. It's global warming's fault. But they know perfectly well that it has nothing to do with that. Or at least they knew it 40 years ago.
Can I just say that really bloody annoying noise is a dog loose in our recording area chewing up a pine cone. And I'm going to have to get that dog put down right now. So I'm just going to have a pause while we deal with that bloody dog.
Hey all, Jordan Harbinger from The Art of Charm here. The Art of Charm podcast is packed with wisdom in the truest sense of the word, from how to become more productive to how to expand your personal and professional networks and manage relationships if you're in one. Productivity, persuasion, influence, time management, biohacking, and a whole lot more. Find The Art of Charm podcast in the Podcast One app or go to podcastone.com.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
So here we are on Delingpole, back with the final section with my special guest, Tony Heller. And we've happily got rid of the dog now. I killed it. No, I didn't really kill it. You may hear it barking from the garden. And Tony is going to tell me about his recent trip to Australia and how this is going to help us in the battle against the evil alarmist conspiracy. Over to you, Tony.
Right. Well, first of all, I love your dog, James. She's great.
Can you confirm to listeners that I didn't actually kill the dog?
Yes, the dog is quite happy and healthy, and it's a wonderful dog.
Good.
I really enjoy her.
Good. All right. Yep.
So I recently, I'm just back from Australia. I was there during the U.S. election, which was quite fun for me. There's a lot of things going on. And I went at the request of Senator Malcolm Roberts, who's a new senator from Queensland, part of the One Nation Party, Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party. And he had he came into the Senate very boldly. The first thing he did was made a speech about ending the global warming scam. He's been very aggressive. He's unlike any other politician in the United States or in the UK or really anywhere else in that he's been extremely, except with the possible exception of Trump.
I think Trump
might
be up there. I don't think he's a true believer.
Well,
yes.
I think Senator Roberts is probably quite a bit more knowledgeable in the details than Trump is, who obviously has a lot of other things to think about. But Senator Roberts, so he had this, I think I mentioned this earlier, he had this Q&A program with Brian
Q&A, which is a very, very left-wing. I mean, the bias is extraordinary. I find Australia, ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation or Company, is even worse than the BBC, if that is even possible. And it is. I've seen it myself. They are terrible.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So Q&A, yes, with a famous episode where he got ambushed by the celebrity physicist Professor Brian Cox.
Right.
Brian Cox poured scorn on him.
Right. Oh yeah, and like I said before, everything Brian Cox said was exactly backwards. He got the whole story wrong from beginning to end. And actually, I was trying to arrange a debate with Brian Cox while I was over here in the UK on this trip.
That's going to happen.
Yeah, because I would really enjoy that.
Yeah, you would.
I would. That would be a lot of fun. So Senator Roberts contacted me. He wanted me to. He talked to Jennifer Murahasi about he wanted to do some sort of response to all this, and Jennifer said, "Well, you should get this Tony Heller guy over from the States." So he contacted me, and I've never been to Australia.
It's great.
Oh, it was had great fun over there. People there were incredibly friendly. So I paid my own way to go there because they couldn't really use official money to bring me over. I paid my own way, but I stayed with great people over there. And we had a series of events in the Parliament. First day on Monday, we had a press conference where we just went over. And Tim Ball, the Canadian climatologist, came down too. And so we had a press conference which went extremely well. All of the Australian press was there. They thought they were going to come up with all this great stuff to report. The whole press was there, and lots of cameras, and they were expecting they were going to come up with lots of great propaganda against Senator Roberts, and we delivered the exact opposite, and we just completely took down everything that Brian Cox had said, and it was extremely effective, and they were sort of speechless.
Well, I bet it didn't get reported in the media.
Yeah, I would imagine probably not, because they didn't. But
they think you're lunatics. Even when you're right, they think you're lunatic.
Right.
You're wrong.
Right. And yeah, and then the next night we had longer presentations, and these presentations were great. I first gave about a half-hour presentation showing how the data had been altered, and then Tim Ball, he's older and he's probably Canada's senior climatologist. He gave a presentation about the motivations, why this had occurred. The whole history of how this scam unfolded. So it was great. Things went extremely well. We had a number of TV interviews during the time. But then the great thing that happened was on Wednesday in Australia, it was Tuesday in the U.S. was the election. And it became obvious around 3 o'clock Australian time that Trump was going to win. So the One Nation Party decided, well, we're going to do this publicity event. We're going to go out in front of Parliament and make a toast to Trump, because they wanted to be clearly associated.
Yeah.
They were Trump's allies in Australia. So we went out. So it was Pauline Hanson, the head of the One Nation Party, Senator Roberts, who love that. He's an amazing guy. And myself went out and we made a toast to Trump. And all the press was there. The ABC was there, and they filmed it. And they started showing this like every 15 minutes for the next 3 days until. And they thought they were going to make One Nation look bad by tying them to Trump. But it was exactly the publicity that One Nation wanted. And then Malcolm Turnbull, the prime minister, did a horrible thing the next day. He went and the day after the election went and signed this horrid Paris climate agreement, which was clearly, a real insult to the Trump administration. So all of a sudden you got this, the Liberal Party has suddenly created a huge rift with the Trump administration, and the One Nation Party.
Nice work, guys.
Oh yeah. And the One Nation Party is all over it now. Now they are, Trump's allies in Australia. They couldn't possibly have gotten better, and the press, I just can't believe how stupid they were about this whole thing. They gave them exactly what they wanted.
What you described there is, I think, emblematic of the increasing tension we're going to see in the world post-Donald Trump between those countries which want to get with the program, or those politicians who want to get with the program, and those who want to remain, who want to cleave to the old establishment science. So you've got the European Union, obviously, which is going to be pumping out this global warming is the greatest threat of our time. You've got Theresa May's government in Britain sort of torn, because they abolished the Department of Energy and Climate Change, good move, but now they seem to be rowing back. And in America, you've got an incoming administration which is going to unravel completely the green edifice, isn't it? If you can unravel a green edifice, I don't know. But you're friendly with a lot of the people, and I am actually, who are going to do this transition into the Trump administration, like Myron Ebel.
Right. Yeah, I think actually Senator Roberts and Tim Ball and myself are going to Washington in December, and we're on December 12th. And
maybe I should go there.
Yeah, you should. Yeah. We're going to do a presentation on Capitol Hill. At least that was the last thing I heard from Myron. I think he's gotten quite busy since then.
Well, just can we anticipate at all how bloody is this going to be? This bloodbath of this slaughter of the green innocents.
I have no idea. I'm not a political insider. The way it certainly started out, it's looking like the people that Trump has appointed have been very solid climate skeptics. I don't see how he could have done any better than Myron Ebel. He's a great guy. I've known him.
So Myron Ebel was Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a sort of free market think tank.
Right.
And he's now been put in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency transition team.
Right,
is that right?
Right, exactly. And Myron is intelligent and honest and hardworking and smart as you could possibly imagine. I've been working with him for years, and great guy. And if I would assume that Trump has appointed these people because he wants to go through with this. It would be very difficult for him to backtrack on this climate thing now because he's got people in place who are very solid skeptics.
Yeah, I wasn't really inviting you to. Neither of us knows what's going to happen in politics, right. But if what happens that we suspect will happen, what effect is this going to have on the U.S. economy, on the scientific establishment? I mean, how dramatic?
Well, I think it'll be a huge benefit to the economy because there was all this effort in the Obama administration to cut back on fracking. Obama gave this interview to the San Francisco Chronicle once where he said, "My plan will necessarily make electricity prices skyrocket." And John Holdren, his science advisor, has been talking about this for years. They wanted to reduce the availability of energy in the United States. Holdren's been saying this for 45 years. And Trump is taking the exact opposite approach. He's saying that the key to bringing jobs and manufacturing back to the U.S. is having cheap energy. So he's going to go out and develop we have these vast energy reserves in the United States and Canada. We got the tar sands in Canada, which Obama has been trying to restrict by not allowing the Keystone Pipeline. So there's all, and plus, if we develop all these energy reserves, we're not buying it from the Middle East. It's less support for terrorism. So there's all these great benefits that are going to come into the U.S. economy from developing these sources. So this election was really a key moment for our economy.
I think so. I don't think any of us has ever attempted, or is it even possible, to quantify the percentage of the global economy, which is being of economic growth, which is being knocked off by this pursuit of expensive energy. Or do you have any idea?
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but I've heard from people that it's huge. It's trillions of dollars being lost to this completely absurd effort to reduce greenhouse gases. If you look at the only thing that really does correlate with carbon dioxide that we can verify is that when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, plants grow faster. We can produce more food. We can feed more people. But the other thing is, if you correlate, is the human condition and growth of economies. Economies that generate a lot of carbon dioxide are strong, healthy economies, and where people live well, and they have lots of food, they have jobs, they have lots of money. If you restrict the energy supply by restrict greenhouse gases, which are going to also restrict the energy supply, make things more expensive, you're going to lose jobs. People get hurt. It's bad. There's that great cartoon, I don't know if you've ever seen it, of the cavemen sitting around in the cave, and they say, so I don't get it. We eat organic food. We live this wonderful natural lifestyle, and we all die by the time we're 30.
Yes. So let's just sum things up. If you are correct that the temperature records showing global warming have essentially been faked, does that completely remove the key pillar of the man-made global warming argument? I mean, is it game over for the warmists if you're right?
Well, first of all, I just want to say, I'm not sure that faked is quite the right word. And we have to realize, first of all, we're dealing with a very small amount of temperature increase. It's like less than a degree they've talked about. And it's more a matter of, I think a lot of it with a lot of these people sort of confirmation bias. They just make a little adjustment here, a little adjustment there, drop this temperature, drop that one. And pretty soon you've got something that looks like a hockey stick. But I think if they were doing their science honestly and without a bias involved in it, you wouldn't see much of anything there. And historically, compared to like periods of like over the last 600,000 years, it's in much larger swings in temperature of like 10 degrees as opposed to recent 0.7 degrees. So it's all because we're just looking at it under a microscope very closely. That we see that it looks bad, but there's really not much going on. But yeah, absolutely, if we get a serious analysis of the temperature record and remove these ridiculous adjustments they're making and the confirmation bias and all the stuff which has created this horrible misunderstanding of the climate, we can focus on actually doing real science. We can get NASA focused on doing, like Trump has said he wants to do, getting them focused on the space program and doing productive things again. There's so much waste of resources and talent and mind power being thrown at this ridiculous global warming problem, which is not a problem. It's manufactured, and getting these temperature records sorted out and finding out what's really going on. And one of the key things, we got to stop using this horrid surface temperature record. They're taking temperatures in parking lots, urban heat island effects, that there's been this bias of losing rural stations and replacing with urban stations. It's terrible. We have much better ways to take temperature now, which are like from satellites. We have these satellites which orbit the Earth, measure microwave emissions from oxygen all over the planet. We have extremely good coverage, and they don't show any warming or very little since the year 2000. And why are we still using these old primitive technologies of this broken record, which we know is largely fake, by Phil Jones' own admission? A lot of this stuff is fake. Why are we still using that instead of using modern technologies? And that's what we need. I would assume that will be one of the key things that the Trump administration will do, will be get away from surface temperatures and use more accurate methods.
And are you a kind of Christian forgiveness guy, or are you more kind of Old Testament? Which is to say, do you think these are bad people who should be punished, or do you think we should just accept the fact that they were just trying to pay the kids' education and the mortgage?
Oh yeah, I'm not a vindictive person at all. I don't want them to go away mad. I don't want them to go to jail. I just want them to go away. I want to see just get rid of this scam and just make it one of the bad moments in history.
Tony Heller, thank you very much. That was fascinating.